Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, as always, and today I'm joined by Dr. Paul Eastwick. He's professor of psychology at the University of California, Davis, in the US. His research investigates how people initiate romantic relationships and the psychological mechanisms that help romantic partners to remain committed and attached. One of his research programs examines how the qualities that people say are critically important to them in a romantic partner direct romantic partner selection and retention. He is also interested in exploring how close relationships research can inform evolutionary psychological approaches, especially with respect to the way that relationships grow and develop over time. So, Dr. Eastwick, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
You bet. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, great. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the evolutionary psychology of romantic relationships, right? And let's just go to the basics first. So, in your work, you've done some work on pair bonding because that seems to be the biological basis for this kind of relationships. Is that correct?
I think many people would agree that humans are a pair bonding species, or at least we are a species that exhibits pair bonding in our mating relationships much of the time. That isn't to say that all mating relationships that you see among humans have pair bonded qualities. In fact, one of the very interesting features of human mating is that you can see, sexual relationships that sort of follow a pair bonding type sequence or type approach that you see in other animals that pair bond, but you also see relationships that are more or less sexual as well, that don't really have much in the way of pair bonding qualities. And I think one of the great mysteries of understanding human mating relationships is trying to get those two pieces to cohere and fit together, to sort of piece together how it is that human mating relationships are similar to but also different from other species.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So there are relationships that are purely sexual, is that it?
Yes, right. And I think that leads to a common viewpoint, which is that, well, that means that there sort of human mating comes in these two flavors, right? There's like the sexual kind and there's the pair bonded kind. And that has led to a lot of theorizing about how, let's say, for example, different types of people might prefer one of those strategies over another, right? So you might be somebody who prefers to engage in more pair bonding strategies than sexual strategies. So you'll have more pair bonded relationships, or maybe you'll just stick to one pair bonded relationship over having many sexual relationships. So it leads to the sort of trade-off style thinking in how we think human mating relationships happen. And I think there is some merit to that idea, but also that it leads to some probably inappropriate dichotomous ways of thinking about how humans pursue relationships.
And these sexual and romantic relationships, let's put it that way,
Yeah.
I mean, do they fall where do they fall in terms of the short-term versus long-term kinds of relationships? I mean, is it the case that both short-term and long-term can be sexual or romantic, or how does it work exactly?
Right. So usually, right. So those are the labels that you also very commonly see in the literature, and sometimes they're used interchangeably. Um, so short-term relationships are like purely sexual relationships. Long-term relationships are like sort of purely pair-bonded relationships, right? Um, so you see both of those distinctions in the literature. Um, I think it's helpful to think about it as not about the length of the relationship. I actually think when we talk about, and again, that distinction has been around for a very long time. I think it actually gets quite confusing. I think it is clearer to talk about a sexual system that evolved for the purposes of sexual reproduction that's been with humans for a very long time, right? extends, deep into our mammalian roots. And then you've got a pair bonding system that evolutionarily is it's sort of built from the roots of attachment, but our closest ape relatives are not pair bonding species. So whatever led us to become a pair bonding species, that's going to be probably more recent in our evolution. So you've got these two different systems that evolved for two different kinds of purposes. The trick is that I think what makes it challenging and confusing, and why we need sort of better over time data, is that when you look over the full history of one relationship, you see these two systems sort of moving and ebbing and flowing in a way that implies that relationships in the early stages will tend to exhibit a lot of hallmarks of sexual activation without much pair bond activation. And then the pair bonding system comes online later. So it is two systems, but they work in a sequence. And so if you take a slice at any given moment in time, well, yeah, you see a bunch of sexual relationships and a bunch of pair bonded relationships. But I don't think that slice reflects what you see if you would be able to look over time and watch the different systems within one relationship rising and falling.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the sort of short-term, long-term continuum, I mean, people move from one to the other in the same relationship, is that it?
Sort of. I mean, the funny thing is that people are usually reluctant to use, for example, the short-term label when it's happening. Right? So if you ask most people when they're sort of in this phase, and maybe they've hooked up with somebody a couple times, but they don't, there's this relationship is sexual, but it's not entirely clear where it's going. If you ask people to put a label on it, they will prefer an "I don't know" option, right? So they prefer to tell you like I don't know where this is going. If you've hooked up with somebody a couple times and then you're like, this isn't really working for me, it is very comfortable to apply the short-term label in hindsight, right? That was a short-term thing. It was purely sexual, but then there was sort of nothing to carry it forward from there. And to me, that is an illustration of you had sexual system activation, two people who were sexually attracted to each other, but the pair bonding system never got going, right? It never really went anywhere. That's fine. That could have been a very evolutionarily adaptive sequence for many of our ancestors to experience. But notice we're not talking about sort of the choice between you can have this sexual relationship over here or this pair bonded relationship over here. I think another implication of thinking about this sequencing over the course of a relationship rather than a choice between two different kinds of relationships is that what that implies is that pair bonded relationships will almost always go through earlier phases where they were largely sexual, right? So a sexual relationship will sometimes lead to a pair bonded relationship and often will not. And so that's I think a different way of thinking about sort of how humans navigate what appear to be very different kinds of mating relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I already had many evolutionary psychologists on the show, and I talked with some of them about short and long-term relationships and the preferences in terms of partner for men and women, and I mean all of those kinds of things. So people in psychological science study short and long-term relationships, but in terms of how people conduct this research, is it that they classify relationships as short-term or long-term, depending on the initial intention of the people who started them, or depending on the real duration that they have?
It's probably more the former. I would say the most common research design is how I would describe it is it's getting at your schemas for what a short-term or a long-term relationship is like. So it would say, ideally in a short-term partner, what would you like, right? Or how would you behave? Ideally in a long-term relationship, what would you like or how would you behave, right? So most studies are conducted in that way, like getting at what I would say, and I don't mean this in any like derogatory way, it's important. It's like it's getting at your ideas as a participant about what short-term and long-term relationships are like. And that's very useful, but getting at the sequencing question, or looking at sort of what happens over the course of a given relationship, is extraordinarily difficult, in part because, in close relationships research, we're very good at tracking relationships over time, except in order to do that, we have to get people who agree that they're in a relationship. Well, that means you're already in what most evolutionary psychologists would call a long-term relationship, right? So if it was short-term, we already missed it, right? It never got to the point where we could even recruit them. So that's sort of one of the grand methodological challenges. It's very hard to recruit people ahead of time and say, what kind of relationship are you looking for? And then you introduce them to different kinds of partners, and then you see what happens. Like that type of research really doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. And is it that people, when they say that they prefer short-term or long-term relationships, I mean, are they good at predicting what they really want or not?
So with respect to that distinction, I guess I would say sort of. So here's something that I always find this a very intriguing datum with trying to understand this difference. So let's take a construct like sociosexuality, which is, sort of a well-validated, important individual difference, assessing the extent to which people are comfortable having casual sexual relationships. So if you ask people questions about their sociosexuality, indeed, and you can show this prospectively over time, if you say you're high in sociosexuality or you have an unrestricted sociosexual orientation, you will have more purely sexual relationships, let's say, over the course of the next year. So that's pretty robust. But what's also fascinating is you'll have more long-term relationships over that period of time too. And that, at least to me, this was really one of the first data points that suggested to me, like, thinking about this as like a binary choose this or that is not helpful. But if somebody who says, hey, I'm comfortable having casual sexual relationships, that means that by virtue of, at least what I think that means, is that by virtue of them initiating more sexual relationships with whomever, means over the course of a given year, that lands them with 6 sex partners, but also one of those turned into kind of a long-term real-ish thing before it disappeared. And what it means is that sort of these people have a lower threshold for being willing to pursue something, or they're just more amorous in general, right? They're more attracted to the people that they see around them. So it is. So I guess to answer your question, I would say yes. Like these sorts of measures do predict the things you'd expect them to predict. But they also predict some other things too that I think make the sort of the dichotomous thinking about short-term and long-term relationships a little bit misleading. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I say dichotomous, but the truth is what I really mean is like hydraulic, right? Like to the extent that you prefer one means that you must shade away from the other, right? And I think that way of thinking about it is probably not quite right.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the individual differences in how people prefer short-term or long-term relationships, does it have something innate to it? I mean, does it have to do with the person's personality? You mentioned sociosexuality, for example, or is it more contextual and it depends perhaps on the sex ratios or something like that?
It's a really good question. I'm sure it does. I'm sure that, I can't really speak to exactly what the robustness is of the evidence for various situational forces on people's sociosexuality, right? I'm sure it's not a common approach. Certainly, I can't think of any experimental demonstrations that you can push people's sociosexuality around. I know there's good cross-national data, right? The David Schmidt studies from 15 years ago or so. That's good cross-national data showing variability. in sociosexuality. So that's certainly been linked to a lot of strong cross-national indicators. That's not really an answer to the question of sort of, is it situational, or is it personality, or is it some sort of interaction of the two, and how does it change over? I mean, we know it shifts with age, right? I mean, so as people are younger, they're sort of more interested in casual relationships on average. So, you know, my bet is that sociosexuality generally carries with it a lot of sort of stable schemas that people carry with them over time that affect sort of what their threshold is for what they're willing to initiate, how comfortable they are having sex in different circumstances. But and I'm sure it's linked to other situational factors, but at least for me, like, the gold standard is you got to show that it can respond reliably to some experimental manipulation that, you know, other scholars can implement and use. And I've never seen that with sociosexuality.
Mm-hmm. Are there any important gender differences in terms of these two kinds of relationships? I mean, is it the case that one of the sexes tends to prefer one type of relationship and the other another type, or not?
So in terms of, you know, sort of individual differences like sociosexuality, absolutely, right? That's a robust sex difference, and you know, you see that cross-nationally. Women are less comfortable than men having casual sexual relationships. What is fascinating to me is that if you look at the trajectory of people's overall relationship arcs, you actually don't see much in the way of sex differences in terms of how men and women feel about their partners. There's a little bit of a difference at the very beginning. So when people initially meet, there's a sex difference such that men are more desirous than women in that moment. But if you follow men and women over time, again, assuming the relationship goes somewhere, so many of those initial impressions just sort of drop out and become nothing. But if you follow people over time, if that relationship ends up going somewhere, the women catch up very quickly. And on average, you don't see much difference between men and women after that sort of initial impression, after that initial point.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Let's talk now about ideal partner preferences, because everyone has sort of an ideal partner in their heads when they think about with whom they would like to mate or have a relationship. And is it that people are good at predicting that someone will make them happy in a relationship?
Yeah. So, you know, I used to think that the answer to that question was, well, when people are in a relationship, they're pretty good at it. They're just really bad at it in initial impression context. They're bad at knowing what inspires that initial passion. And as time has gone on, I've actually become more skeptical of the whole enterprise. Some of that is the way our understanding of the stats have changed in ways that sort of gets a little arcane that I won't get into here. But from my view, as we've started to understand how to approach this research question sort of carefully and rigorously, I am becoming more and more skeptical that people's ideal partner preferences mean what we think they mean. They definitely mean something, but I don't think they quite have the implications that we long assumed. So where I am skeptical is I'm skeptical about the implicit matching idea. And the matching idea goes something like this. You have a set of ideals for what you're looking for in a partner that are meaningfully different from other people's ideals, right? Mm-hmm. You say you care about intelligence in a partner, and I say I care about warmth. So we assume that that individual difference has meaning. And so what that should imply is that the extent to which an array of partners that you have or might want to have, the extent to which they're intelligent should affect your liking, your choices more than it affects my choices. And warmth should affect my choices and my liking more than it affects yours. And we never see that. We never see that individual differences in what you say you like versus what I say what I like, right? In a given sample, individual differences never seem to have that kind of predictive power. And so I think when people are telling us what their ideals are, they're able to sort of convey a population average, right? They know they'd rather be with somebody who comforts them than, is violent to them. But the extent to which people differ from each other is not a useful metric of predicting what they will eventually like when they meet somebody face to face.
And here we are talking mostly about people's stated preferences. I mean, what they say they like. We're not talking about perhaps their implicit preferences or something like that.
Right, exactly. So almost always these sorts of preferences are reported on scales, or we've done versions of this where we throw out the scales and we just say, okay, tell me what you want, and then it's sort of a free response kind of thing. But it's almost always done in an explicit way. We have one study where we started to get into the implicit approach to looking at this. I wouldn't put too much money on that one way or the other. As far as I know, nobody's even tried to replicate it. So it's one of those things where it's like, that didn't really go anywhere, but the explicit approach is very, very popular and very, very common. And yeah, you will see many different interpretations of the explicit data about what it means.
And when people get things wrong, I mean, when they, for example, say that they want an ideal partner that has that and that trait and so on, and then they are wrong about that, I mean, is it that people are wrong about their own preferences, or that they simply predicted wrongly that they would like a certain kind of people and not the other?
I think it's the former, in that it's sort of the extent to which your ideals idiosyncratically match a particular partner's traits. It's just going to correlate with how much you like that person at like 0.05, right? It's very, very small. So the predictive question is a little different. That tends to come into play if you think about online dating context. And now this is speculation that I'm about to engage in, but I would anticipate that one reason that people find online dating disappointing is because when they're looking at profiles, they're drawing from these ideas about what they like. And so they are selectively picking the people that look good to them on paper. But if that just has effectively no correlation with what you're going to like when you actually meet the person face to face, that's like classic regression to the mean, right? So you're picking the people that you're elevating your own expectations by picking the people you think look good, but that's going to be a random draw once you meet face to face. So you are going to be disappointed by the time you meet face to face. Some of them you'll still hit it off because again, it's a random draw. But I think that is probably where that experience of online dating is so disappointing. I'm so excited when I'm browsing the profiles, and I'm so disappointed when I meet these people in person. Why do all these people lie? Like, it might be that they're lying, but it also just could be regression to the mean.
And then there you are referring both to physical and psychological traits. I mean, people, when they meet someone face to face, and first they looked into their profile online, for example, and then they get disappointed. Is it both kinds of traits, or only one of them, or what?
Well, I think it's all of those things. I think the way. I mean, online dating sites vary in terms of how much information you get. Are you getting whole essays by the person? Are they encouraging you to do sort of communication ahead of time, right? And that's going to provide a lot more detail than if it's just, a picture and a couple key pieces of demographic information and you swipe left or swipe right, right? So there are certainly big differences in the way that these different sites are structured. And so I think I was just making a general comment about when you're using the apps or you're using the websites, by virtue of sort of having such a selection where you can cater to your own ideals and you can cater to your own sort of expectations, if you then surmise that what you meet and how much you're going to like that person is a fairly random draw of the people that you might have presumably had a chance to meet, then that random draw on average is going to be sort of lower than your elevated expectations were. That's not to say that online dating is a bad system. In fact, it's an amazing system, because one alternative is just single people never get a chance to meet each other, and that's not ideal at all. But sort of, there are probably better ways of managing expectations, sort of instead putting your efforts into more but perhaps shorter dates with people, even if maybe they didn't pass all your thresholds on paper. Sort of expand that pool, try to meet more people, but maybe for shorter amounts of time. That would sort of be my advice to somebody, sort of based roughly on what we know.
And talking about mating people in shorter dates, let's say, or shorter periods of time, what about speed dating studies? What can we learn about mate preferences from those kinds of studies?
Well, so I think speed dating is very useful for understanding quick initial impressions, right? And I do think that initial face-to-face impression, it matters a great deal. It's sort of qualitative. It gives you a real, a very different picture about how you feel about somebody relative to when you're reading about them. I think even relative to when you might be interacting via chat or something like that. So I think it's very useful for that purpose. And again, under most free choice circumstances, like going on a coffee date where you can choose to go on a second date or not, it's going to be important that that first impression goes at least somewhat well in order for people to then want to have a second date and a third date and so forth. Sometimes speed dating is likened to a short-term mating situation. I think that is wildly incorrect. I think if you go to a speed dating event, this is not like some sort of like wild college dance party, or some sort of eyes wide shut situation with everybody wearing the masks. Like, that is not what's happening. These are people who are often awkwardly trying to have a conversation with a complete stranger, and really it's 4 minutes of people trying to find something that they have in common, something that they can talk about, right? Whether it's where they're from or what they're, we did it with college students, so they're talking about where they're from, what their major is, and where they live, and like what they enjoy doing in Chicago. And that's like about all that you can do in a period of 4 minutes. And they just hope that they hit on something that gives them like a little bit something interesting and novel, and something a little bit exciting to talk about. And the good dates are the ones where they land on something, and the bad dates are the ones where they don't. But short-term mating, that is not what you would not go to speed dating for that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, and are these dates useful? Is speed dating useful in terms of obtaining information from a potential partner? I mean, what sorts of information can people get by interacting with others in this way?
I think what they get is that sense of like, hey, we're having a conversation here that's really clicking, or not, or it's really not clicking, right? So you can get this, you will learn a little bit about their traits. You'd certainly learn about their extroversion, right? You probably learn a little bit about their agreeableness. You can certainly learn a lot about whether you find them attractive or not. You see consensus on all of these traits, right? And speed dating is very useful for being able to look at perceiver effects and consensus effects and relationship effects. But I think mostly what people are looking for is that sense of like, hey, that was a conversation that went really well. That'd be somebody that I'd be excited to talk to again. And then, speed dating gives them the means to do that. But but I think in some ways a deeper answer to your question is I don't think in general when people are assessing like, is this somebody I want to date? I don't think they're really looking for traits. What they're really looking for is something like compatibility, something like this is an interaction that's going well. This is somebody that I'm enjoying spending time with. I don't think it's like, they're trying to like maximize their like stats of who they got in a partner. Like, oh, look, I landed somebody with like the best suite of desirable traits. And I think that's another common thread in the literature is sort of thinking about this sort of like trait maximizing approach, and that's the way people go about dating. And I don't think that captures especially well what people do when they're out there really dating in the real world.
Mm-hmm. And about these traits that people get a sense of from other people when they are interacting in this way, do you know if they get them right just by these 3 or 4 minutes of interaction or not?
Yes and no. It depends on what you mean by get them right. So do people achieve consensus? Absolutely. They achieve consensus about almost every trait, meaning that the 12 people you met, they're gonna agree about how attractive you are. They're going to agree about that pretty strongly. But they're also going to agree about how ambitious you are, and they're going to agree about how extroverted you are. And they're going to agree about how open to new experiences you are, right? There's a lot of consensus that happens in first impressions, right? That's true in the romantic domain. That's true in sort of the regular person perception domain too, right? This is like Dave Kenny, like this work has gone on for decades and decades. People are very good at picking up consensus. But if it's accurate, now we have to start talking about stereotypes, right? And so one reason that people achieve consensus early on is because they're drawing on stereotypes when they initially meet somebody. As they get to know that person, they usually start relying less on stereotypes and more on, the personality of the person, like what that person is actually like. But what's fascinating, what Dave Kenny and others have shown, is that the level of consensus actually doesn't really change, right? So people hit consensus very quick and they stay there, but underlying that, it's because they're moving from using a stereotype, which is often inaccurate. It depends on the trait, it depends on the context, but right? So, and then they move to getting sort of the truth about what a person is like. And I think that happens with a lot of what's going on in the romantic domain as well, with one caveat, which is for some romantically relevant traits, that consensual component, that's sort of like, oh, but like how attractive are you really, right? How romantically desirable are you really? If you give people enough time, what you start to see is that consensus starts to come down. And that is potentially because the Dave Kenny model applies in the beginning. So when we initially meet each other, we get a sense of how attractive they are. We agree on who's desirable and who's not. But over time, romantically, that starts to fade. And we start developing these increasingly idiosyncratic impressions of who's desirable and who's not. And that, I think, is a very useful feature for a species that is potentially going to engage in pair bonding. Because in a pair bonding species, what is important is not that you find the quote-unquote best partner. What's important is that you find a compatible partner, right? Somebody that will be as bonded to you as you are to them, with whom you can sort of pursue your various mutual goals, right? Usually there's a lot of interdependence involved in pair bonded species. And I think that sort of that way that we show consensus and the way that it declines over time, I think is relevant to the pair bondedness of our species.
Mm-hmm. So you've also done some work on the relationship coordination and strategic timing model, or the ReCAST model. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So that goes back to the short-term, long-term distinction mainly. And that model suggests that the short-term, long-term difference, right? The difference between short-term, primarily sexual relationships and long-term, primarily pair-bonded or attached relationships, that the difference there is that you're catching relationships at different portions of normative relationship development. So short-term relationships are relationships that only progressed to an early point in this normative sequence but didn't get any further, right? That's not to pass judgment on those kinds of relationships. That's just, it was sexual, and then that's all it was. Nothing else happened from there. And again, with all sort of the adaptive caveats, that could have had a lot of adaptive consequences in our evolutionary past. But often, sexual relationships can grow into pair-bonded relationships, where you see the development of attachment and all sort of the hallmarks of attachment, like proximity seeking, separation distress, like this used to be a purely sexual thing and now I feel awful when I'm apart from this person. So those features tend to develop more over time. So essentially the model suggests that the reason we see these different kinds of relationships is because essentially whether these are the schemas people have or we're actually carving up relationships in this cross-sectional way, you're seeing relationships that reflect different portions of the normative arc of relationship development. But it's really sort of one process that can stall out anywhere along the way.
Mm-hmm. And do we know what makes relationships last? I mean, does it have something to do with the mate preferences and if their partner fulfills or has those same traits that people prefer? Or does it have something to do with people's expectations or what?
It's a good question. So, once a relationship is going, right? So you catch people and now they're in an established relationship, or at least they agree they're in a relationship together. There's a lot of information that we can pull from to predict that relationship is going to be going well or be going badly. It's obviously much easier to predict the present than it is to predict the future, but we can predict the future somewhat well. To the extent that you have trust, to the extent that, your partner, you feel that your partner is responsive to you, to the extent that you think your partner is committed to you, like all of these various relationship-specific factors are good signs for how that relationship is going to go. But in terms of assessing something before it really gets underway, I mean, there's almost literally nothing. We know nothing, right? Like the data aren't collected. We know that some people are generally happy people. So if you get a sample of people who, let's say, are not depressed and they're not in a relationship and you follow up with them a few years later, yes, they'll be happier in their relationships, but that's not really the kind of answer that we really want. What we really want to know is like, okay, but this dyad is a better fit than than if you'd been partnered with somebody else, right? We want to create well-functioning dyads. We don't just want to sort of diagnose who's a happy person and who's an unhappy person. And I hope within the next few decades we get to a point where we could make those kinds of predictions, but right now we really can't.
Mm-hmm. But that bit that you mentioned there, it's very interesting. You said that happy people tend to have happier relationships. Is that it?
Yeah, right. And so you perceiver, I would call those perceiver effects, and those are extremely useful. They're correlations of 0.2, like they totally matter. But you can predict a lot about how a person's relationship is going to go from other features of their personality. So things like if they're generally satisfied with life, they're going to be generally satisfied in their relationships, right? People who tend to have, who are prone to mood disorders, they are more likely to be unhappy in their relationships. There's sort of all sorts of main effects like that. And those perceiver effects are they're not. They are somewhat stable over adulthood. Another way of looking at this is that if you look at how satisfied somebody is in one relationship, how satisfied will they be in another totally different relationship? And the correlation is like 0.2, right? So people who are happy with this person are probably going to be happy with this person. Now you can also look at that and say 0.2, so like actually, that's not super high. So if you're miserable here, like, try a new relationship, because the correlation, is only 0.2, with how you're going to feel over here. So you can sort of splice it both ways. But there is stability in people's perceptions. I think the trick, though, is that what we really want to do is sort of pair people with the right person. And to do that, we got to understand where compatibility comes from. And I think compatibility is likely to be something that people create. It's likely to be something that people sort of work out and develop as a relationship grows. They sort of set the stage for patterns later that are either going to be good or bad, often unwittingly, without realizing that those are the patterns that they're creating. I don't know how you would predict that kind of stuff ahead of time, right, before the relationship really gets underway.
Mhm. And these happy people, do we know something about their personality traits, like, for example, in terms of the big five? Because I would imagine that for someone to be happy, they would be, for example, low in neuroticism and probably high in extroversion or something like that.
Yeah, I think neuroticism is of the big five. I think neuroticism is the one that tends to emerge the most commonly. Probably also agreeableness. I think the other three don't emerge quite as often. There's small effects there. They're not especially huge. We you know we had a big project recently spearheaded by my former postdoc, Samantha Joel, and it was a machine learning project where we sort of took all of these data across 43 couples data sets and used all this data to try to predict sort of how satisfied people were they going to remain satisfied over time, was their satisfaction going to change over time. We predicted it from all the individual differences we had, all the relationship specific factors that we had in these various combinations. So we could look at what were the individual differences that tended to matter the most, and it tended to be things like depression and satisfaction with life. It also included things like attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance. So anxiously attached and avoidantly attached people also tend to be less happy in their relationships on average. And it included, other things like age too. Like, generally speaking, people who are younger tend to be happier about their relationships than older people do. So there's a variety of effects like that. Neuroticism of the big five is the one that pops the most, but there are other sort of more targeted, more relationship relevant constructs like attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance that tended to pop a little bit more often than, say, neuroticism.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So is it that people with certain personality traits tend to be unhappier in their relationships independent of the person they're with, or
So there's some data that speaks to that. So our data couldn't speak to that exactly because we just have people in one relationship, and that's the vast majority of relationship data sets. But there are a couple data sets out there that do look at people's multiple relationships over time, and I can think of one by my colleague, Dr. Rick Robbins here at UC Davis, and so again they show like that. That stability of about the correlation of about 0.2, 0.25 between your relationship at one point in time, your relationship at the next point in time. And they find consistent personality predictors of that too. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head sort of exactly what those correlations are, but I'm sure that neuroticism is one of the stronger ones in that group. So if you're neurotic at time one, that predicts that you're less satisfied at time one, and it also predicts that you're less satisfied in your second relationship later on.
yeah. And what about when people end relationships, when there's some sort of romantic breakup? Are people good at predicting how that will affect them emotionally?
So So a yes and no. People generally tend to overestimate how bad it's going to be. That's an average tendency. So if I imagine you to think about, oh, what if you broke up? How distressed would you be? And you will tend to provide a higher value than what you actually provide when that breakup actually happens. Um, but in some ways, it's the flip side of the what we talked about earlier with the ideal partner preferences. Now the individual differences really do correlate with how distressed you are. So if you say, oh my gosh, I'm going to be devastated, and I say, I think I'll be fine, that difference will hold if you look at our actual distress later. You will be more distressed than I am. We both overestimated, but the individual differences mattered. So that's a case where, is the prediction accurate? Well, it's inaccurate in the sense that we overestimated, but it's accurate in the sense that the relative difference between you and me meant something in terms of our actual distress later.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's just talk about one last topic. As I mentioned in the introduction, you are also interested in trying to understand how relationship science might influence evolutionary psychology and also the other way around. So could you tell us about that?
Yes. So generally speaking, a lot of, my methodological background is really in the close relationship space. And so what that means is that I was brought up on techniques like doing longitudinal analysis following relationships over time, things like Dave Kenny's social relations model. So getting large numbers of perceivers and targets and understanding how those impressions are formed, the kind of data that you can only get when you have multiple perceivers and multiple targets. And so that has led us to sort of bring those lenses to questions that are often of interest to evolutionary psychologists, like what is the difference between these short-term relationships over here and these long-term relationships over here? Like when you think about it, not in a hydraulic choice kind of way, but you think about it as a developmental process, you end up seeing a mating system, a structure in humans that's a little bit different than sort of what much of the literature had assumed previously. And the same thing with the person perception elements. I found it very useful to understand the concept of mate value by thinking about consensus in the way that person perception researchers would have talked about this idea, that in order for somebody to have mate value in the way evolutionary psychology has often talked about it, there would have to be agreement, right? There would have to be consensus about whether the person has this desirable trait. And so if we see consensus moving around, and we do, initial impressions, it's high. As people get to know each other, it drops. That means that mate value is a thing that matters more here than here. It matters in initial impressions. It doesn't matter as much as people get to know each other. So there must be other factors like compatibility that we need to be paying more attention to. I think, too, that relationship science can obviously learn a lot more from the high-level adaptive thinking, sort of taking some of those broader evolutionary meta-theoretical perspectives and incorporating some of those into our work, right? I think one of the greatest, most central blind spots in all of relationships research is that we tend to think in long-term relationship good, breakup bad, right? We assume that sort of it's, and our writing will sometimes reflect that bias, right? It's sort of I don't know how much people do this anymore, but in the older writings, they talk about sort of like relationships failing, right? And those are data points that we can't use. But I do think if you think about it sort of in a longer lifespan way, if you think about multiple kinds of relationships having had adaptive consequences in our ancestral past, if you think about sort of people moving from one relationship to another as part of a sequence that might be adaptive for various reasons, you get out of that myopic thinking about like, well, there is one primary relationship and everything external to that is a threat, or everything external to that is sort of harmful to the person, right? evolutionary psychological meta-theoretical perspectives, I think, provide this more holistic view that get us away from like that very, very dyadic sort of old-timey nuclear thinking about like there is one couple and like everything else is a problem.
So do you look at this relationship as complementary, let's say, or do you think that one of them, like for example relationship science, can inform evolutionary psychology in the ways that you presented, because evolutionary psychology has some weaknesses at those levels? Or
yeah, so my personal opinion is that generally speaking, relationship science methods are pretty great. We can always do more innovating, but the fact that our approach for a long time has been to let's look at people's real relationships as they're happening and track them over time, I think is a very strong methodological feature of what we've done. It's not the only great method out there, but I think that, at least in my mind, close relationships research has that methodological edge. I would give the edge to evolutionary psychology, and this isn't just vis-a-vis close relationship research, it's sort of vis-a-vis all of social psychology, in that I sort of agree that there's not really many other coherent meta theories out there, right? I mean, we need the theory of evolution by natural selection to really dig into the big, broad questions about why people do what they do. And I think, close relationship scholars need to have those sorts of questions, those sorts of high-level abstract ideas in mind. And we do need to be thinking about those approaches. So I think those are the strengths of the two fields, of the two approaches, and so I think bringing them together can generate a lot of good insights.
Great. So, Dr. Eastwick, let's end the interview here. Just before we go, where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me, just have a website, pauleastwick.com. I'm a light user on Twitter, at Paul Eastwick, and yeah, that's where you can find me.
Okay, great. So I will include links to that in the description box of the interview down below so that people can go and check it out. And Dr. Eastwick, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you for inviting me.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And I would really like to keep doing this in the long run, and so please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there, or go to my PayPal links in the description box and you can also make a monthly pledge there, or a one-time big donation, or several times big donations. It's as you prefer. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. Finally, I would like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and supporters, the main ones: Karen Litska and Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anjan Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Eric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Staten T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, JW, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, and Dmitry Grigoriev. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.